Hi everyone, I'm Judah Vitale, functional nutritionist, lifestyle coach, and heart math mentor. And this is the second in a series on adrenal glands and adrenal function. In the previous video, I discussed basic overall adrenal physiology. Basically, we could say adrenal physiology 101. I went through the different hormones that the adrenal glands secrete, how the adrenals work in conjunction with the autonomic nervous system. And today what I want to talk about is the signs, symptoms, and types of cortisol dysregulation. Now, the adrenal glands are what help us to respond to stress. They're responsible for our ability to adapt to and respond to stressors, whether they be immediate, life-threatening in the fight or flight, or if it's long-term, chronic. And that's what we're really going to focus on today, because in the modern era, we as human beings, especially in Western society, in the United States here, are experiencing long-term chronic stressors unlike we ever have before. And a long-term chronic stressor is anything that isn't life-threatening but just wears on you over time. So we're talking about maybe you're in a job that isn't fulfilling and is really stressful. You have chronic financial strain, family issues, relationship issues, chronic health challenges. When we have chronic health challenges, that's a stress response in our physiology. Maybe you have leaky gut or irritable bowel syndrome, and that causes a stress response in your physiology. And all of this stimulates the release of cortisol by the adrenal glands to help regulate or respond to that stress. And many times what will happen is we will have this initial stressor and cortisol gets released to basically as an acute reaction to handle that stress. But over time, as the stressor continues and we don't do anything to modify it, either we don't change the stress, get rid of it, or do some sort of stress management technique that helps us to be able to cope better. But over time, what will happen is the adrenals will continue to secrete cortisol and continue to secrete cortisol. And a normal cortisol rhythm is that it rises in the morning and it peaks between 8 or 9, and then it gradually goes down the rest of the day, and it hits its lowest lows between midnight and 3 o'clock. Now that's the normal rhythm, rising in the morning, we wake up, and then it goes down. And as it goes down in the evening, the normal reaction is that melatonin gets secreted in the pineal gland to help us sleep. Then that subsides around 3 or 4 in the morning, and then cortisol begins to go up. So this is our circadian rhythm hormones. This is how we're tied into the day and night. Okay? Now, over time, if the adrenals have to keep secreting cortisol to manage the stress that we're experiencing, this begins to have a variety of effects on cortisol production. So I'm going to go through something a little technical here, and I would just want you to bear with me. But the key raw material here is cholesterol. And cholesterol gets converted into pregnenolone. And pregnenolone will convert into DHEA, which I talked about in the last video. And pregnenolone will also convert into progesterone. Now the raw material for cortisol is progesterone. That's one of the raw materials. Progesterone eventually converts into androstenedione and into estrogen. So that is kind of your hormonal chain there. Progesterone will also convert into aldosterone, which I also spoke about in the previous video, and that helps with elevating blood pressure. So now here's the picture, is that cortisol has a rhythm to it. But over time, when the stress isn't managed, if you're not getting rid of the stress, or reducing the stress, or you're not doing a mind-body awareness technique like heart math or meditation, breathing, yoga, any type of mind-body awareness technique that can help with lowering cortisol, what begins to happen is the cortisol rhythm begins to dysregulate. And so one of the first things we'll start to notice is that normal rhythm, high in the morning and going down in the evening, what might start to happen is perhaps it drops a little low in the afternoon. And so if you ever experience that 3 o'clock crash, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, every day you crash, that's usually a sign that your cortisol has gotten lower than it should. And so you get this rise, and then you get kind of this bottom out, and then maybe it starts to come up and you feel better around dinner time. Your energy comes back and you feel good. Well, that's a rhythm dysregulation. So that's usually one of the first things that I've witnessed with adrenal and cortisol dysregulation or dysfunction. The next thing that can start to happen is that maybe you don't get the 3 o'clock crash. Let's say it comes 10 o'clock at night, your normal time for going to bed, and all of a sudden you're awake. You have the, quote, second wind. But maybe it's not a second wind. What can happen is that instead of the cortisol going down, it starts to go up again at night. So now you get this rise, this fall, and then maybe you get the 3 o'clock crash, then it comes back up and you feel good around dinner, and then maybe at bedtime it starts to go back up again and you feel awake. Now, one of the signs of this is that you might feel wired but tired. So you're exhausted, you're really ready to go to sleep, but at bedtime you just feel totally wired. And I call that the wired and tired symptom of elevated cortisol in the evening. So it's high when it shouldn't be. Now, as stress continues and the adrenal glands get more and more tired, or they're having a harder time keeping up, now what you might begin to experience is low cortisol in the morning. So rather than the cortisol rising and you having plenty of energy in the morning, maybe you feel exhausted in the morning. You wake up, you've got a full night's sleep, but you still feel exhausted. You slept 8-9 hours, but you got to drag yourself out of bed. And this would be a sign that your cortisol didn't rise like it's supposed to in the morning. And that it's maybe you got a little bit of a rise, got a little bump there, but not enough to get into normal levels to feel energized in the morning. So now perhaps what happens is you feel exhausted in the morning, you might get a little energy in the afternoon, crash around 3 or 4, feel good around dinner time, and then at bedtime you feel super exhausted but wired, and your cortisol has gone up again in the evening. So now you can kind of see this little bit of roller coaster action happening is going on there. So you've little rise, not enough, you feel tired. Lunchtime you feel okay. 3 or 4 o'clock you crash. Dinner time you start to feel all right again, and then you feel wired and tired at night, and it's really hard for you to go to sleep, and you get a full night's sleep, but you feel exhausted in the morning. As this goes on and on, now you might hit kind of the flat line. And I see a lot of this where people, their cortisol rises just a little rise in the morning, but then it just kind of stays flat the rest of the day. And this is where the person is just exhausted all the time. Now, these rhythms that I'm describing to you, I see these patterns when I do what's called an adrenal stress index test. And that's a way to test your cortisol via saliva. So now, the Western side of medicine, for the most part, doesn't believe in adrenal fatigue. They don't believe in adrenal exhaustion. They say it doesn't exist. And when they test your cortisol, if you go to your standard Western medical doctor and they do labs on you, they might test your morning cortisol via blood. And that's really not accurate. One, because adrenals have a rhythm to them, as I've been describing to you. Your cortisol is at a different place at different times throughout the day. So just taking a snapshot of it in the morning in your blood isn't really the full picture of what's happening with your adrenals. You can also test via urine, and that's very accurate as well. I tend to use saliva. So with the saliva, with the adrenal stress index, what we have people do is they collect their saliva at 4 points throughout the day. First thing in the morning between 8 or 9, again around 11 and 1, again between 4 and 5, and then around midnight. And what this does is it gives a full picture of your cortisol rhythm. And based on looking at God knows how many of them that I've looked at throughout my career, I've seen all sorts of cortisol dysregulation issues. And so I'm a real firm believer in testing salivarily, using saliva to test cortisol levels, rather than just treating with adaptogens. A lot of people will immediately go to using things like ashwagandha, holy basil, eleuthero, panax ginseng. These are all known adaptogens that work with the adrenals, but that's not necessarily what you always want to do when you're working with cortisol and adrenal function. You may not need to go there right off the bat. And you might need something a little stronger than that, or maybe something a little weaker than that, like just a Nervine. So rather than just saying, oh, I have adrenal fatigue, or I have this particular experience, and you throw a dart in the dark and try taking adaptogens, I find it to be really important to do an adrenal stress index to get the full picture on what's happening with your cortisol rhythms before treating. So that is the signs, symptoms, and types of cortisol dysregulation. In the next video, I'll be discussing the ABCs of adrenal imbalance. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through all the different factors that affect adrenal function. And this is really important. I want to thank you for watching, and have a nourishing day.